Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this evening I'll be speaking about another discourse of the Buddha. This one is the Puṇṇamasutta from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, sutta number 82. So as usual, I'll start with homage to the Buddha, and then I'll read through the sutta and give some explanations, and you're welcome to type in questions at any time. And once I've gone through the discourse, then I'll respond to any questions. As long as they're relevant to the discourse that we've been going through. So I'll start with reciting the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhaṃ dhammāṃ saṅghāṃ namassāmi. As mentioned, this is the Puṇṇamasutta from the Samyutta Nikaya, chapter 22, sutta number 82. And I am reading here from Bhante Suddhāso's translation, but as usual, I'll be making some adjustments as I go along based on my understanding of the Pali. And I'll also be explaining relevant Pali terms as necessary. So first off, the word Puṇṇama means full moon. Literally, it just means full, but it's commonly used to mean the full moon. So the discourse begins, and it's called this because this discourse takes place on a full moon night. So it says, at one time the Buddha was staying near Sāvatthi in the longhouse of Megara's mother in the eastern monastery, together with a large community of mendicants. Now at that time it was the Uposatha. So the Uposatha is the observance day, the spiritual observance day, which in actually pre-Buddhist Indian religious tradition, it was common on the full moon, the new moon, and the half moons to set aside a day for spiritual practice of some sort, for some kind of religious or contemplative practices. A bit similar to the Western tradition of going to church on Sundays and keeping Sunday as a holy day, or similar to the older Jewish tradition of not working on Saturdays, taking Saturdays as a day of complete rest. So similarly, in ancient Indian religious tradition, one would take the lunar quarters as your weekly day of religious practice. So the Buddha adopted the same system into Buddhism, and we still have it to this day. We still to this day have the Uposatha days, which most commonly are the full moon and the new moon. And then sometimes also the half moons. And these are set aside as days for refreshing one's commitment to the precepts, to the moral foundations of Buddhism, and also for committing to doing more intensive practice for a day. And in the suttas, it's commonly also a day when the Buddhist monks would meet together and would engage in Dhamma discussion. They would meet together to recite the Buddha's teachings, to discuss the Buddha's teachings, to help to clarify anything they were uncertain about or anything they wanted explained in more detail. So the sutta continues. So again, at that time it was the Uposatha, the full moon on the 15th day, and the Buddha was sitting in the open surrounded by the community of monks. Then one of the monks got up from their seat, arranged their robe over one shoulder, raised their joined hands towards the Buddha, so that's their hands in Anjali is what it says in Pali, and said, Bhante, I would like to ask the Buddha about a certain point, if you would take the opportunity to answer. And the Buddha says, well then, monk, take your own seat and ask what you wish. Again, as I mentioned on the Uposatha day, the monks would often gather together in order to discuss the Dhamma, and also as a chance to ask the Buddha or other senior monks questions. So the monk sits to one side and he says, Bhante, are these the five and I have to explain this word in Pali. Are these the 5 upadana kanda? Upadana means grasping or clinging or acquiring, and kanda means component. So it's commonly translated in English as aggregate, which is not a particularly useful translation, in my opinion. Mostly because most people have no clue what the word aggregate means until they start studying Buddhism, or they start studying Masonry. Those are the only places you normally encounter this word in English. So the khandas in Buddhism, khanda or skanda in Sanskrit, khanda means the components of body and mind. So body and mind, the Buddha divided into 5 distinct component parts that we can then analyze and examine separately. And the Buddha said that these 5 components are subject to grasping, to the tendency to try to hold on to them or to form an identity based upon them, or to use them as a basis for preferences, for desires and aversion. And when we do that, then the 5 khandas, the 5 components of body and mind, then become a cause of suffering. And not because there's anything wrong with the khandas themselves, but rather because of our misappropriation of them. So appropriation is another way one can translate upadana, appropriating or acquiring. So because we have this unwholesome tendency to relate to body and mind through the lens of desire, aversion, and delusion, then it becomes what's called the upadana khanda, the components affected by grasping or clinging or acquisition, appropriation. And that then is what becomes the cause of our dukkha, of our suffering. So the monk says, Bhante, are these the 5 upadana khanda, the 5 components of body and mind subject to grasping? That is the body, feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness. And the Buddha replies, yes, yes, they are. Just a word here about the translation. So again, I'm looking at Bhante Suddhāso's translation, and he had translated this as form, feeling, perception, choices, and consciousness. So translating the first one is rupa. So rupa means your physical body. So translating that just as form is okay, but it needs to be understood that it refers specifically to the physical form of your body. So rupa means your physical body. Second one, feeling, is Vedana. So it needs to be understood here that Vedana, translated as feeling, does not refer to emotion, but rather it refers to the experience of pleasant, painful, and neutral. So anytime we experience any sensation, we identify it as pleasant, painful, or neutral. So that's what Vedana means. Vedana means the reactive quality that we have towards a sensation. Do we react with desire? Then it's pleasant. Do we react with aversion? Then it's unpleasant or painful. Do we react with apathy or ignorance? Then it's neutral. Then the third one is a sanya, which is translated here as perception, and that's okay. So sanya more precisely means recognition. It's actually, the word sanya actually means memory. But in the context of the 5 khandas, it has a slightly broader meaning. It's the process of identifying or labeling experiences. So we have some experience and we place a concept onto it. We place a label onto it. We identify it. We recognize it. This is called sanya. For example, if you have some sensation, so the initial arising of the sensation, our first response is, do I like this? Do I hate this? Or am I neutral towards this? That's our first response. Our second response is, and what is it? So for example, let's say you hear a sound. The first movement of mind is to think, do I like this or do I hate this? Or am I neutral towards it? So maybe you hear the sound and you're like, oh, that's an unpleasant sound. Actually, initially you just recognize that's unpleasant. Then we try to identify, what is it? And we're like, oh, that's the sound of the neighbor's music. So that's sanya. Sanya is identifying it as music coming from the neighbor. Vedana is just identifying it as painful. Then labeling it, identifying it, music from the neighbor, that's sanya. Then the fourth one is called sankhara. And actually, I could talk for about 3 hours just on the word sankhara, so I'll keep it very brief. So sankhara, in the context of the 5 khandhas, sankhara refers to mental activities. So this can include active thinking. It can include more complex emotions. It can include memories. It can include visualizations. It can include a wide variety of mental activities, as distinct from the previous 2. So as distinct from feeling, which again is just pleasant, painful, neutral, and sanya, which is identification of experiences. Then sankhara is mental activities. So in this example of hearing the neighbor's music, so first off, you have a body. Your body has ears. So through the physical body, you encounter a sound. Then you identify it as painful experience. Then you identify it as neighbor's music. That's sanya. Then the fourth one is when you start thinking, you're like, I really hate my neighbor. I hate their music. This is awful. I should try to get them to turn it down or stop, or maybe I should move away. That's all sankhara, those mental activities in relationship to the experience. Or maybe you like the music, and then in the fourth step, you're like, oh, this is so wonderful. I should find out who it is. I want more of this. So either way, it's the mental activities and engagement in relationship to whatever's going on. And then the fifth one is, in Pali, it's called vijnana, which is commonly translated as consciousness. And vijnana in the suttas most commonly is defined as awareness of a sensory domain. So chakku vijnana means visual consciousness. So awareness of your visual domain. Then sota vijnana is auditory domain, awareness of your auditory domain, awareness of the field of sound that you're hearing. So and so on for each of the 6 senses. It's awareness of a sensory domain. So this monk is first just asking the Buddha, so do I have this right? Are these the 5 components of body and mind, which are subject to misappropriation, subject to grasping, which leads to suffering? And the Buddha says, yep, those are the 5. So the monk says, good, Bhante. Says sadhu. Actually, in Pali, it says sadhu, Bhante. Then he says, he asks another question to the Buddha. He says, Bhante, what is the root of these 5 grasping components, these 5 components of grasping? And the Buddha says, these 5 components of grasping are rooted in desire. And the monk says, Bhante, is that grasping the exact same thing as the 5 components of grasping? Or is grasping one thing and the 5 components of grasping another? So this is an interesting question. So we have the 5 components of body and mind, and we have grasping. So this monk is asking, are these things the exact same thing? Like, is our grasping the same thing as body and mind? Or are they 2 completely separate things? There's body, mind, and then there's grasping. And the Buddha's answer is, he says, neither one. Neither. He says, rather, the desire and greed for them is the grasping there. So his answer, neither, is interesting because it's pointing to the conjoined nature of desire, grasping, with the 5 components of body and mind. And this is pointing to a deeper aspect of the Buddha's teachings, which is that what we find throughout the suttas is that there is nothing in our experience which is not part of the 5 khandhas. So grasping and desire cannot be separate or outside of the five khandhas because nothing is outside the five khandhas. There is nothing extra or in addition to the five khandhas. So desire and grasping are already fully integrated into the five khandhas. So they cannot be said to be something separate. However, a fully awakened being still has the five khandhas. They still have these five components of body and mind, but they no longer have grasping. They no longer have desire and diversion. They no longer have this misappropriation and misidentification that characterizes unawakened beings. So in this sense, one also can't say that they're the same thing, because it's possible to have the five khandhas, but without having grasping, without having any desire and attachment in relationship to them. So the monk says, Sadhu Bhante, and he asks another question. He says, Bhante, can there be different kinds of desire and greed for the five components of grasping? And the Buddha says, yes. He says, it's when someone thinks, in the future, may I have such a body, or such feeling, or such perception, or such mental activities, or such consciousness. Says that's how there can be different kinds of desire and greed for the five components of grasping. So this is just pointing out how we tend to want to have particular experiences in the future. It's like, oh, in the future, I want my body to feel like this or to be like that. Or I want to have these feelings or those feelings. I want to have these kinds of experiences in the future. So the desire to have a specific mind-body experience in the future. And so the monk asks further, he says, Bhante, what is the scope of the term components as applied to the components? So in other words, what exactly does khandha mean? How far does this extend? What does it include? What does the word khandha include? And so the Buddha starts, he says, any kind of body at all, past, future, or present, internal or external, solid or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, this is called the component of body. Again, that's rupa, physical form, the physical body. Any kind of feeling, perception, mental activities, or consciousness, past, future, or present, internal or external, solid or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. This is called the component of feeling, perception, mental activities, and consciousness. And the Buddha says that's the scope of the term components as applied to the components. So again, just making it clear that the five khandhas is any experience of these, past, future, or present, internal or external, gross or subtle, near or far, all of it is included in these words. Again, everything in our experience, now and in the past and in the future, everything in our experience is encompassed by the five khandhas. It can all be categorized into one of these five categories. So then the monk says, he says, Bhante, what is the cause? What is the reason why the component of body is found? And he asks the same for the other four. So body, feeling, perception, mental activity, and consciousness. What's the cause? What's the reason why these things happen? The first one, the Buddha says, the four principal elements are the reason why the component of body is found. So that's the four great elements. This is the experience of solidity, fluidity, temperature, and motion, which commonly is called earth, water, fire, and air. But this is metaphorical. It's meant to understand that our experience is the experience of earth-like things, so things that are solid, of water-like things, things that are fluid, liquid, of temperature, heat and coolness, and of motion, which is particularly noticeable with the experience of breathing, of air. So that's the basis of our experience of the physical body. Our experience of the physical body is the experience of these four physical attributes: solidity, fluidity, temperature, and motion. Next, he says, sense contact is the reason why the aggregates of feeling, perception and mental activities are found. So again, coming back to the example I gave earlier of hearing the neighbor's music, there's sensory contact. And because of that sensory contact, then there was a feeling. So the feeling of displeasure. There was identification, identifying the sensory experience. And then there were mental activities. So thinking about the sensory experience that's happening. So for this reason, the middle three are the basis for, are based upon sensory contact. And then the fifth one, the Buddha says, mind and body are the reason why the component of consciousness is found. So in Pali, this is nama and rupa. So nama means mind, and rupa means body. And there's, again, in the translation of this text here, so nama is translated as name, which is not correct. So the word nama, depending on context, it can in fact mean name, but it can also mean mind. And in the context of namarupa, it means mind and body. And in fact, it's clearly defined as such elsewhere in the suttas. The Buddha clearly says that namarupa, nama means the mental components of experience, rupa means the physical components of experience. So then nama, mind, rupa, body. But the word nama is also used more literally to mean name. Like kinnamosi means what is your name? What is your nama? In fact, it's related to the English word name. But again, in the context of namarupa, it means mind and body. So mind and body. Because we have a mind and body, then we're capable of having sensory fields, and therefore capable of being aware of sensory fields. So that's why mind and body is the basis for the component consciousness. So the monk says, good Bhante, and then he says, Bhante, how does substantialist view come about? And substantialist view is the translation here for Sakkaya Ditthi. And substantialist view is very interesting, but very meaningless. So just the people here in the room, when you hear substantialist view, does that mean anything to you? I'm getting shaking heads. Same here. Very cute, very meaningless. I've actually read his long essay on why he translated the word in that way. It's a really boring essay. He makes a very good point, though, so I actually understand why he does it. But nobody's going to actually stop and read an essay to explain the meaning of one term. So the Buddha himself defines Sakkaya Ditthi very simply. He defines Sakkaya Ditthi as identifying body and mind as self, or identifying any component of body-mind as self. This is Sakkaya Ditthi. And Sakkaya Ditthi is one of the basic root delusions that separates awakened beings from unawakened beings. So unawakened people think this body is me, this mind is me, these thoughts are me, these emotions are me. Whereas the awakened person recognizes the body is not me, these thoughts are not me, these emotions are not me. So this is Sakkaya Ditthi. Sakkaya Ditthi is the belief, I am this body, I am this mind, or some permutation thereof. So the monk is asking, where does that come from? Like, where does this self-identity come from? So Sakkaya Ditthi could be more accurately translated as self-identity view. Just to break down the word a little bit for those who are curious. So Sakkaya Ditthi. So the sa means self, kaya means literally body or group, and ditthi means view or perspective or belief. So Sakkaya Ditthi means belief in one's own body, or belief that the body is self, or belief that the group of components is self. So this is the more literal meaning. So Sakkaya Ditthi I've seen elsewhere translated as identity view, or belief in self-identity, and that's much more accurate. So just the people in the room, if you heard belief in self-identity, is that a bit more understandable than substantialist view? Still a little bit mystifying, maybe? A little bit? No? Actually clear? Okay, wow, good, clear, okay. Okay, yeah, Sakkaya Ditthi, belief in self-identity. It's forming a self-identity, specific self-identity of body and mind, and believing in it. So this monk is saying, how does that happen? Where does that come from? And interestingly enough, the Buddha actually answers the question, because elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha just says there's no beginning to be found to such things. But here he gives an answer. He says, when an uneducated, ordinary person, so this means someone who's not heard the Dhamma. So it doesn't mean someone who hasn't been to college or something. It means someone who hasn't heard the Dhamma. When an uneducated, ordinary person has not seen the noble ones and is neither skilled nor trained in the teaching of the noble ones, has not seen true people, and is neither skilled nor trained in the teachings of true people. So these are both ways of talking about awakened beings. So noble people, true people, these are talking about awakened ones. So somebody who has had no contact with the teachings and trainings of the awakened ones, then the Buddha says they regard the body as self, the self as possessing a body, the body as in self, or the self as in the body. Or they regard feeling as self, self as having feeling, feeling as in self, or self as in feeling. They regard perception as self, so perception, identification, recognition. Self as having perception, identification, recognition, or that is in self, or self is in that. The same with mental activities and consciousness. And the Buddha says, this is how Sakkaya Ditthi comes about. So this is how there comes to be the belief in self-identity, the specific self-identity. So it's regarding body, feeling, identification, mental activity, or consciousness. So any of those five, either as self, as possessed by self, as in self, or self is in that. So altogether that comes to 20 distinct forms of self-identity, specific self-identity. So 4 modes of relating incorrectly to the 5 components of body and mind. So a very useful list, because generally speaking, when you look at that list of 20, you'll find at least one that you relate to. You're like, oh yeah, that's me. And usually you'll find that you actually relate to all 20 of them to one degree or another. So then the monk says, good Bhante, so sadhu Bhante. And then he says, Bhante, how is there no Sakkaya Ditthi? So how can there be no belief in self-identity? And the Buddha replies, so the inverse of his previous answer, he says, when a learned disciple of the noble ones has seen noble ones, is skilled and trained in the teachings of noble ones, has seen true people, and is skilled and trained in the teaching of true people, they do not regard the body as self, the self as having a body, the body as in self, or self as in the body. And then the same for feeling, perceptions, mental activity, and consciousness. So he says, this is how there is no belief in self-identity. So this actually is right here, that's the instructions on how to attain stream entry, on how to attain the first stage of awakening. Regard the 5 components of body and mind as not myself, not belonging to myself, not in myself, and myself is not in them. So recognizing that these 4 modes of relating to the 5 khandhas are inaccurate or not true. If you develop that perception, that recognition, then one can attain stream entry, the first stage of awakening. But normally we approach it in a bit more roundabout way, which is recognizing the impermanent, insubstantial nature of body and mind, the 5 khandhas. And in so doing, then we infer that that also then cannot be ourself. Since it's insubstantial, it cannot be ourself. So usually we approach non-self through the lens of anicca sanya, the recognition of impermanence. So then the monk asks a further question. He says, Bhante, what is the gratification, the drawback, and the escape when it comes to body, feeling, perception, mental activity, and consciousness? So the 3 ways of examining things, gratification, drawback, and escape, comes up a number of places in the suttas. So the Buddha didn't actually encourage us to see everything in the world as awful, but rather he encouraged us to recognize the gratification in things, but also to recognize the drawback, the danger, the disadvantages, and the escape. So this monk is asking, well, what is the gratification, drawback, and escape in relation to the 5 components of body and mind? So the Buddha says, the pleasure and happiness that arise from the physical body, this is its gratification. That the body is impermanent, unsatisfying, and perishable, this is its drawback. Removing and giving up desire and greed for the body, this is the escape. And then he says the same for the other 4 khandhas. So it's quite simple. What is the gratification of the components of body and mind? The fact that sometimes they produce pleasure. Pretty obvious. What's the drawback? The drawback is that the components of body and mind are insubstantial, they're impermanent, they're changeable. That means they're unreliable, unpredictable, uncontrollable, which means they're unsatisfying. Often we want our body to feel pleasant, but instead it feels painful. We want our mind to be full of happy thoughts and happy emotions, but instead it's depressed or confused. We want to see certain things, hear certain things, taste certain things, but instead we get other things that we don't like. So this is the drawback. We want pleasure, but it's not reliable, it's not predictable. It's not something that we can depend upon. So this is the drawback. So then what's the escape? In other words, how do we escape the suffering caused by the unreliability of body and mind? And he said it's through giving up desire and greed for these components of experience. Then the mind is able to experience true happiness. So the monk says, Sadhu Bhante, and then he asks a further question. Getting into even more profound stuff, he says, Bhante, how does one know and see so that there is no I-making, mind-making, or underlying tendency to conceit for this conscious body and all external stimuli? So this is a bit of a fun word in Pali. So he's asking, how can there be no ahankara, mamankara, mananusaya? So ahankara, the word ahang literally means I, as in me. And kara means making or doing. So ahankara means making a sense of me, making an I, an ego. Mamankara, mamang means mind. So that means mind making, creating a sense of possessiveness. So ahankara, a sense of self-identity, mamankara, a sense of possessiveness, and mana nusaya. Mana means the self-concept, the concept of self. And anusaya means the underlying tendency. So he's asking, how can one know and see in such a way that the tendency to create self-identity, possessiveness, and conceit in relationship to this body with its consciousness. So the Pali is saviññāna ke kaye, so this body with consciousness, as well as to all external phenomena. So in other words, both to our own body and mind, as well as to all external phenomena, how can we change our way of conceptualizing and seeing the world so that we stop creating a sense of self in relationship both to our own body, mind, and also to the outside world? So the Buddha says, one accurately sees any kind of body at all, past, future, or present, internal or external, solid or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near, all body with right understanding in this way. This is not mine, I am not this is not myself. One accurately sees any kind of feeling, and again he goes through the same thing, past, future, or present, internal or external, solid or subtle, inferior or superior, far or near. So all feeling, perceptions, mental activity, and consciousness as this is not mine, I am not this is not myself. So again, cultivating the perception of non-self in relationship to the 5 khandhas. And so the Buddha says that's how to know and see, so that there is no I-making, mind-making, or underlying tendency to conceit regarding this body with its consciousness, as well as all external stimuli. And the sutta says, now at that time, one of the monks thought, so it seems that the body, feeling, perception, mental activity, and consciousness are not self. Then what self will the deeds done by not self affect? And it says, then the Buddha, knowing that monk's train of thought, addressed the monks. He says, it is possible that some futile person here, unknowing and ignorant, their mind dominated by craving, thinks they can overstep the teacher's instructions. They think, so it seems that the body, feeling, perceptions, mental activity, and consciousness are not self, then what self will the deeds done by not self affect? So this is one of the delightful things about the Buddha, is that the Buddha was a telepath, and he was constantly reading people's minds, and he used that primarily as a teaching tool, so that he could understand what teachings he could give that would be most relevant to the people that were there. How could he teach in a way that would help them to understand the Dhamma? So in this case, the Buddha picked up that one of the monks in the audience had misunderstood the teaching and needed more specific instruction that would help them to understand clearly. So one of the monks had this thought. They're like, okay, so if the 5 khandhas are not self, then it says, what self will the deeds done by not self affect? In other words, he's saying, so body and mind are not self, but they're still doing actions, and that therefore needs to affect some self. Like there must be some person somewhere that's affected by the choices done by body and mind. So this monk was just trying to create the idea of a truly existent being external to the 5 khandhas. Trying to create the idea that there's some ongoing soul or true being that is not included within the 5 khandhas, not included within the 5 components of body and mind. And as I've mentioned before, throughout the suttas, it's quite clear that there is nothing outside the 5 khandhas. So the monk was trying to then say, well, okay, if the 5 khandhas are not self, well, then there must be something outside of the 5 khandhas that actually is self. There must be a true self that is outside of the 5 khandhas. So that's effectively what this monk was thinking in his mind. And the Buddha caught that, and he decided to point it out specifically. So the Buddha continues. He says, now monks, you have been educated by me in questioning with regards to all these things in all such cases. That's a very odd way of translating this. Let's see. Patipujja vinita kome tumhe bhikkhave tatra tatra tesu tesu dhamesu. He says, monks, you have been taught through counter-questioning regarding all of these teachings. Okay. Yeah, the translation here was a bit unclear. So one of the ways the Buddha would teach is through, he would ask questions. Rather than other people asking him questions, he would ask them questions. And then based on how they replied, he would guide them towards a correct understanding of the Dhamma. So that's what the Buddha is saying. He's saying, I've already taught you through questioning about these things, about these Dhammas, about these teachings. So now he's going to do it again. He says, what do you think, monks? Is the body permanent or impermanent? And they reply, impermanent, Bhante. He says, is feeling permanent or impermanent? The same perception, mental activity, consciousness. And they reply, impermanent, Bhante. The Buddha says, if it's impermanent, is it suffering or pleasure? So is it dukkha or sukha? Is it unsatisfying or is it satisfying? Is it painful or pleasant? And the monks reply, it's dukkha, Bhante. It's dukkha. It's painful. It's unsatisfying. It's a source of suffering. The Buddha says, if it's impermanent, unsatisfying, and perishable, is it fit to be regarded as this is mine, I am this is myself? And the monks say, no, Bhante. So of course not. If you see something as being ephemeral, insubstantial, constantly changing, unsatisfying, unpleasant, subject to arising and ceasing, then you can know clearly, oh, this is not my true self. This is not who I am. This is just some temporary changeable experience. It's not me. And that's actually good news, by the way. When some painful emotion arises, you can recognize, oh, this is not me. We don't need to take it personally because it's not who we are. So the monk says, so you should truly see, and he goes through again, talking about seeing body and mind as not self. And here the text is elided, but the Buddha says, seeing in this way, then one abandons one's desire and aversion in relation to body and mind, one abandons self-identity in relationship to body and mind, and one attains full awakening. So that's the end of this discourse. So this time we can respect the discourse with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, and hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Carol, Scott, Vanessa, Sean, Maria, Bhumika, Manal, Geeta, Mike, Gregory, Wasabi-chan, Jayanta, Janaki, Jody, Yankee, Victoria, Amaranta, and anyone else who's joining in. And I see a couple questions here. Mike says, would the mind and body translation of name and form also work for dependent origination, or does it use different Pali? So yes, also in Paticca Samuppada, it's the same term, nama rupa. So nama rupa, which I translate simply as mind and body, because that's what it means, and that's immediately recognizable in English. One of the older translations, which is a little clunkier, but also pretty accurate, is mentality and materiality. So nama is mentality, and rupa is materiality. So it just means mind and body. It's just saying it in a more awkward way. But translating nama rupa as name and form just creates endless confusion. You always just wind up needing to define what you mean. You wind up needing to say, well, name actually means mind, and rupa actually means body. And then people are like, oh, okay, got it. But translating nama rupa as name and form, I've never known anyone who understood immediately what that was talking about. So yeah, it's the same. In dependent origination, it's the same term, nama rupa. Then Mike says, where does intention come given there is not self? What are the causes and conditions leading to intention? Where does intention come given there is not self? Why do you think there needs to be a self in order for there to be intention? So this is one of the things that the Buddha points to, is that there is this assumption that there must be some kind of true self in order for conscious experience to happen. But that assumption has no basis. It's a widely held belief with no basis. So we just assume that there has to be some kind of soul or true self or something in order for choices to happen. But the Buddha's point is that that's not a necessary component at all. We think it's a necessary component, but it isn't. Reality functions perfectly fine without self. Always has and always will. And that's the last question online. So I think we'll go ahead and conclude at this time with 3 more sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.